Okay, welcome everyone. Just doing the last minute checks with our technology. I think it's my fault. I've been cursed today. So it's so lovely to see you all here. I hope you enjoyed your introduction to the exhibition with our curator, Pamela Ford. My name's Gail Chapman. I'm the Public Programs Officer here, so I get the fun job of organising all of these events and activities. And we're really delighted that so many of you were able to join us this evening. We've actually had a waiting list and everything, so it's been great. So you are the lucky few. Now, this evening we're going to begin with a lecture here with Dr Amanda Herbert, who I'll introduce properly in a moment. And then we're going to head outside for some refreshments, some chocolate tasting, and hot chocolate making. And then we're going to have a tour of the garden with Dr Henry Oakley, who'll be focusing in on some of the plant ingredients that feature in the recipes exhibition that you've seen upstairs. Now, just a small plug before we start. If you would like to come back and see more, we do have a couple more events. We have a free museum late on the 3rd of July where Pamela's back again, but doing a behind-the-scenes look. So she'll have some of the materials that didn't make it into the exhibition, the original Elizabeth Blackwell herbals, some of those sorts of things. So we'll have that out, and you're welcome to come along for free and have a look at some of that material with her. And we also have, I think, 3 tickets left for our Teas from the Garden workshop in July with our wonderful garden team. So if you would like to come join us for that, it's well worth booking a ticket now before they all go. Okay, so to get started, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Amanda Herbert, who is the Associate Professor of Early Modern Americas in the History Department at Durham University. She's a historian of the body, gender and sexuality, health and wellness, food, drink, and appetite. She holds the PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University and is the author of Female Alliances, Gender, Identity, and Friendship in Early Modern Britain. So we also have a winner of the book award from the Society for the Study of Early Modern Women for that publication. She's also published articles in Gender and History, the Journal of British Studies, and Early American Studies, among others. And she's the editor for the Recipes Project, which is an e-journal devoted to the study of historical recipes. So if you haven't had a look, it's a project you can look at online, and there's all sorts of fascinating articles in there about recipe books like ours and many others across the world. So she's also working on a grant-funded collaborative project, such as a 1.5 million folder Shakespeare library project before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures, and writes for all sorts of audiences. So I'm sure it will be a very entertaining talk today. So I will hand over to her now.
Thank you so much, Gail. It's a lovely introduction, and I'm just delighted to be here. And thank you as well to the whole team who made this very innovative and exciting and multifaceted program possible. So today I'm going to be talking about people whom you might not expect to think about as contributing to household medicine and also food making. You'll notice that I'm going to be talking a lot about medicine and a lot about food at the same time today, and that's because in the early modern period, the two were really indistinguishable or tied together. Early modern people thought that everything that you put into your body, whether it was a food or a medicine, had an effect on its health, and so that's one of the reasons why we see culinary and medical recipes in the same books. All right, so to begin, artificial intelligence, or AI, is rewriting our world, and recipes are no exception. In the summer of 2024, freelance writer Ralph Jones tested a series of AI recipes for The Guardian. The results were unexpected. After slogging through bad prose, nonsense typography, and strange flavor combinations, Jones and his family were pleasantly surprised by a Sri Lankan currywurst curry, an unlikely dish that, despite the strange appearance and odd ingredient list, tasted good. The dish works, Jones admits, although he was also careful to state that not all of the AI-approved recipes he encountered, especially the one for bratwurst ice cream, would have been as successful. And if we navigate to one of the many online AI recipe streams that Jones explored for his article, we get the sense that the author, in fact, got very, very lucky the night that he taste tested that currywurst curry and found it not terrible. AI-generated recipes are funny, if a bit stomach-turning, but they're based on a simple premise. The internet is full of recipes, and computers can now read, parse, and recombine these instructions into new formations, despite never having tried, tasted, or tested them themselves, since computers can't eat, at least not yet. Let's take a look at this video created by AI, which tells us how to make a pizza at home.
At what age did you discover that if you layer slices of bread in a baking dish, add ketchup, cheese, bell peppers, olives, chopped ham, cubed cheese, and sprinkle oregano on top, then bake it for a few minutes, you'll get a bread pizza so tasty it feels like it came straight from a bakery.
So, as anyone who has ever eaten pizza will tell you, something with that is not quite right. And it prompts the question, what makes a recipe trustworthy, reliable, and also worth saving, preserving, or passing on? Do you have to have tried it yourself in order to understand it? In the 17th and 18th centuries, women and men wondered the same thing. When they encountered a recipe or a remedy that they believed was worth keeping, they recorded it, most typically by hand, and in casebooks, account books, and recipe collections. In some lucky instances, these books were passed down, saved, and valued for generations. And through the work of institutions like the Royal College of Physicians, they are still available for us to read and learn from today. In the pages of these books, we can see how medical authorities from hundreds of years ago assessed knowledge about health and well-being. What they reveal is that lots of different kinds of people imagined themselves as medical authorities. This certainly did include university-trained physicians, but also people like apothecaries, barber surgeons, midwives, traveling healers, herb growers, and village practitioners. And we know this because of a practice called attribution. Within the pages of their books, women and men attributed recipes for medicines and for food. They included named references to the people who had donated entries. Attributions most often appear in the margins next to a recipe, or sometimes next to the title or at the very end. They are often in the gaps and spaces which surround the recipe itself. In a world before AI, crediting and attribution allowed practitioners to make their texts seem trustworthy and reliable. Cultivating senses of trustworthiness and reliability was crucial in making sure that any collection of knowledge was saved, preserved, and remembered. So who contributed to recipe books and who got attributed for their cures? Just as they do today, early modern recipe attributions most often came from friends and family members. In the 1730 British recipe book by Dorothy Penniman, for example, a recipe to pickle onions was described as coming from her sister Churchill. Manuscript recipe attribution was also practiced in the Americas. Martha Washington, wife of the first U.S. President George Washington, contributed a medical recipe for worms to her granddaughter Nellie Park Custis Lewis's Virginia manuscript book. That doesn't mean that these recipes always worked the way that they should. In Eliza Pinckney's 18th century South Carolina manuscript book, one recipe for a salve for corns, which Pinckney dutifully wrote had been given to her by a Captain Bilby, met with no approval, with Pinckney commenting, "NB, I found no benefit at all from this salve." But recipes weren't just attributed to family and friends. Author-compilers on both sides of the Atlantic attested to the authority and expertise of outside bodies, including scholarly or scientific societies, publications, and periodicals. In the 18th century British manuscript entitled Cookery and Pharmaceutical Recipes of the Mallet Family, the author-compilers referenced the Royal Society when referring to a recipe to cure the biting of mad dogs. Similar practices were deployed in the Americas. In Virginia, Eleanor Lewis added a cure for a consumption to her recipe book, which she sourced from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. In South Carolina, Mrs. William Timmons included a recipe to destroy rats, which was attested to because its creator had received a premium of 5 guineas from the Dublin Society for this receipt. Eliza Pinckney included similar attributions in her South Carolina book. A recipe for the gout had been taken from part of an advertisement, and another one for the croup in children came from the Journal of Health. And the Rapp family, who lived in Ohio in the early 19th century, included recipes that they had gleaned from the Baltimore paper in their manuscript volume. In all of these instances, the institution or the periodical was the one that attested to the recipe, offering a sense of authority and trust. In mentioning recipes as donations from family and friends, as well as from trusted sources like journals, newspapers, and periodicals, author-compilers worked to make their recipes seem authoritative and also effective, but they were sometimes attributed to lower status practitioners, laborers, and tradespeople. You didn't have to be wealthy to get into a recipe book attribution. This gives us a sense of the many people from many walks of life who contributed to the making of medicines and food in pre-modern Britain and the Americas. Recipe books held right here at the Royal College of Physicians, some of which appear in the exhibition outside, contain references just like these. An anonymous collection of medical and culinary recipes dating from 1667 to 1671 boasted that it contained a rare eye water and that the recipe had cost £100 sterling. The author-compiler of this book noted that the recipe for the rare eye water had been acquired from an Italian mountebank by the Earl of Kelly. Now, considering that the average laborer earned just £9 per year in this period, the cost for this rare eye water recipe represented nearly a decade's worth of wages for most people. Nor was this the only Mountebanks recipe I've found in manuscripts from the period. Thomas Sheppey's handwritten medical recipe book included instructions for curing the stone colic, which involved roasted garlic, black pepper, a hint of nutmeg and sugar, butter, toast, and beer, specifically a pint of the strongest ale you can get. And Sheppey noted that this frankly delicious-sounding boozy toasted garlic bread was a Mountebanks receipt. Now, mountebank was a word used in the period to describe traveling medical practitioners who sold remedies and medicines and provided health advice in public markets, streets, and squares. Sometimes called quacks or quack doctors, these practitioners attracted customers by using entertainments, fireworks, sleight of hand, songs, and chants, and sometimes even by staging false, even miraculous cures on the spot. Now, this is another great document from here and at the Royal College, and it gives you an example of the ways that mountebanks are both kind of made fun of, but then also respected within the period. So this is a satire, and the man on the top left, who's got one eye closed, he's winking at us, is a famed mountebank from the period who had also invented an eye water recipe. But that doesn't mean that mountebanks' practices or their remedies were entirely dismissed or disrespected, even though they appeared in some satires from the period. They were also thought to have secret, specialized knowledge, and thus were included right alongside trusted recipes from formally trained apothecaries and physicians in some recipe books. Now, other medical practitioners from lower down on the social scale and who lacked university training were also included in recipe books. Dorothy Penniman's medical and culinary book contained a cure to stop a looseness in a lying in, which is a cure for diarrhea experienced during child labor, which she had acquired from Mrs. Deans, the nurse keeper, who may have been a midwife or a wet nurse, given that the cure was for pregnant women. Another nurse, named in a recipe book as Nurse Cresset, had her name inscribed in between two different recipes, one for a sore that is like to break and another a salve for an old sore. While it isn't clear from this manuscript whether Cresset contributed to one or both of these, her name was included on the page as a testament to her knowledge and skill. Medical practitioners like apothecaries and barber surgeons were also mentioned in recipe books, albeit in sometimes indirect ways. Mrs. Knight's early 18th century book contained a testimony from Mr. Lipid Bodman, apothecary at Newbury, who told Knight that he had cured a poor man when he was a pupil at Bartholomew Hospital, a reference to St. Bart's, via a tincture that he had invented of herbs, roots, and alcohol, which, he said, stopped the mortification and cured the man without cutting off his leg by these drops only. An anonymous recipe book from 1634, associated with the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries of London, included instructions for the most excellent gargle that can be made, which was intended to preserve the teeth. Patients were told, however, that if they wanted the remedy to work, they needed to have their teeth cleansed first by a barber. People like barber surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, and nurses would have learned their medical skills via apprenticeships and also on-the-job training. But not everyone who contributed to recipe books even had this much formal education. Some recipes came from the aged poor, such as instructions for an ointment in one book, which was from, quote, an old woman who had grown crooked in her hams. And farm workers even contributed, such as this one from Sarah Yates, who was employed at Mr. Byram's farm in Millgate, and who contributed a recipe to a book for a diet drink against a fit, a seizure or convulsion. This is held here at the RCP as well. Now, American books followed the same practices. The Rapp family book included a recipe from a man named Mr. Williams, who was a Quaker near Kendal, and instructions for a new kind of potato dumpling, which was the invention of Mrs. J. Myers's girl. Some contributors were even strangers. The Rapp book featured a new way to cook tomatoes, which the owner had gotten from a traveling woman from Hardin County to Leesville. Now, despite the fact that 17th, 18th, and early 19th century women and men in both Britain and America routinely included attributions as well as attestations in their books, as we've seen, one group of practitioners rarely got credit: enslaved women and men. Despite the fact that we know that they performed most, if not all, of the labor in cooking, preparing, serving, and administering food and medicine, Black women and men were not widely recognized as trustworthy sources of expertise and authority in the pages of manuscript recipe collections. Now, these collections otherwise tell us so much about food and care in this period, but they are stubbornly silent on this fact. Close reading of an entry for making plum marmalade from Eliza Pinckney's South Carolina book makes this type of occlusion particularly clear. I'll give you a couple of minutes to read over the recipe yourself. Now, the Pinckney book is especially revealing or unrevealing when it comes to attributing recipes to Black women and men, because Pinckney left so many other written records which give us a much fuller picture of her life and her work. Pinckney lived on an estate in South Carolina where she enslaved hundreds of women, children, and men. In a recent post on the Recipes Project, Rachel Love Monroy found that other records from Pinckney's estate, letters, estate papers, accounts, show us that Pinckney forced Black people to do nearly all of her cooking and medicine making, and she recorded that diligently in all of her other papers. But none of the many Black people whom we know from this evidence labored in bondage for Pinckney were mentioned in her recipe book. Rather, the author-compiler mentioned a fellow white woman. That was a marmalade which she wrote, "I saw Miss Baird make." Pinckney had watched a white woman cook this jam, and she then wrote an entry about it. But no matter how many times she observed Black women and men cooking in her kitchen, she refused to include even one entry on their skill or their work in her book. This was a refusal which defied both pattern and habit in the ways that Pinckney thought about recipes and wrote them down in many other contexts. Now, enslavers did very occasionally mention the people that they held in bondage in their recipe collections. One notable exception in this regard was the Virginia housekeeping book of Eleanor Nellie Parke Custis Lewis. Lewis's handwritten book contained recipes attributed to white servants, newspapers, medical journals, physicians, neighbors, and friends, but also to people she named as Old Doll, Old Letty, Dulcie, and Hanson. These were likely references to enslaved women and men on her estate. Of the 176 recipes in her book, only 6 contain such attributions. 4 of them are culinary recipes: Hanson's mode of making chicken broth, the best in the world, which you can see up right now, Hanson's thin biscuits, Hanson's breakfast biscuits, and Old Letty's peach chips. and then also 2 laundry recipes, Old Doll's method of washing colored dresses and Dulcie's mode of doing up muslin, silk, cambric, and stuff. Among this group, Hanson's mode of making chicken broth stands out, as it also contains an attestation to the quality of this dish, with Lewis describing it as the best in the world. It's nonetheless telling, I think, that Lewis felt it necessary to include an additional attribution and source of expertise at the completion of Hanson's directions, writing that recipes of this type were the best remedy for cholera morbus, so thought Dr. Jennifer, who is celebrated for the cure of that disease. Now, I will say, too, just as an aside coming from Durham, that John Snow is typically credited with the cure of cholera. But it's possible that Lewis was thinking of William Jenner, who worked on typhus and typhoid. So there's some confusion here on her part. But I think that what's essential for us to notice is that she really feels like she needs to bring in an additional authority to kind of prove the goodness of this recipe or the utility of it. For the most part, when people of color did appear in Anglo-American recipe books, they were represented as racist stereotypes. And this is true of recipe books composed in British American and American households, but also those from metropolitan Britain. In his 1675 British manuscript book, Thomas Sheppey recorded that the Indians draw blisters by laying small pieces of spunk or touchwood on the limb, then set fire to it and let it burn down. It will draw a blister, which will run many hours. Now, Sheppey doesn't specify here whether this came from an imagined West Indian or East Indian tradition, and I think that speaks to the way that these spaces were often amalgamated by British colonizers into one exoticized space. In the Ohio Rapp family book, 2 recipes, one for the dysentery and then another to stop the bleeding of the lungs, similarly were imagined by the author-compilers as Indian cures. In both of these cures, indigenous people were referenced only as a generic stereotype. People of African descent were subjected to similar processes of recipe book stereotyping. In Mrs. Knight's 1740 British Metropolitan book, a recipe to stop a violent bleeding immediately was supposedly practiced in the West Indies among the blacks. Another recipe in the same book for curing the bite of a mad dog, Knight had copied from a Mr. Ingram, and she related that Mr. Ingrams observes that in one season of the year, the dogs in the West Indies are particularly subject to madness. I have known a great number of Negroes bit by them. Like the previous recipes, people of color are mentioned here not to give them credit, but instead as a curiosity, a gimmick, or a stereotype. We aren't learning about individual black women and men, but the blacks, or the Negroes, as a racist generic whole. Author-compilers thus deliberately stereotyped, anonymized, and denigrated people of color during their practices of recipe book making. And given this evidence, it would be understandable to argue that premodern manuscript recipe books, like a lot of artifacts and objects preserved in European museums and archives, are sources which can't and won't speak to Black and Indigenous experience. But what I'd like to suggest is that it is possible, with very careful and close attention, to identify remnants, hints, traces, and legacies of Black and Indigenous culinary and medical knowledge in these admittedly sometimes problematic sources. This involves working, as Marisa Fuentes suggests, along the bias grain of the recipe archive, by reading around and between the generic conventions as well as the racist stereotypes contained in some historic collections. It additionally means cultivating a rich scholarly appreciation of Indigenous medicine and food and of Black Atlantic foodways and medical ways, to identify evidence of the tools, ingredients, and techniques that were used by Indigenous and Black makers in unique and specialized ways. The quassia cup is one of these tools. This wooden cup, now held here at the RCP, was made from the wood of the Quassia amara tree, a plant species which originates in Jamaica. The plant was named by Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in 1762 after and in honor of a Black medical practitioner named Kwasi Mukambe, also known as Kwasi and Graham Kwasi. Born in Ghana at the end of the 17th century, Kwasi was captured, enslaved, and transported to Suriname in South America, where he was forced to work on sugar plantations, one of the most dangerous and life-threatening forms of labor in this period, with life expectancy rates of just 3 years after arrival. Kwasi was, however, a skilled medical and spiritual healer and advisor, and he used his knowledge to tend to other enslaved people in his community and to earn money by charging Europeans for his medicines. Around 1730, Kwasi discovered the medical properties of a plant which, when made into a tea, could treat fever and ward off parasites. Practitioners on both sides of the Atlantic began ordering and using quassia cups in their own practices, and objects like this serve as attestations of their own kind, surviving in museums, archives, and libraries around the world today. But recipes themselves can also reveal Black and Indigenous knowledge. Although on the surface they may not contain straightforward attributions, by looking at some of the surrounding information, references, and applications in these entries, we can find very suggestive but also very intriguing evidence of the Black and Indigenous people who helped to make them. Returning to the Rapp family recipe book, compiled in Ohio, we can see that one of these medical recipes attributed to Indigenous people to stop the bleeding of the lungs called for whole wild sunflowers, dried, pounded in a powder, and then sifted, to be taken 2 or 3 times a day in molasses, tea, or cold water. Sunflower has wild origins in North America and was unknown to Europeans before their invasion. It does not typically appear as an ingredient in British and American recipe books, but it was used widely by Indigenous people as a medicine and traditional food. And sunflower has been cultivated in the Ohio River Valley for over 2,000 years. Stories about the utility of sunflower as both food and medicine continue to be shared in greater Ohio River Valley region Indigenous communities through to today. Dr. J.T. Garrett, member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, specialist in native medicine, and recognized by tribal members as a medicine elder, shared in an oral history interview in the 1990s that sunflowers were and are always planted first within gardens and agricultural plots, where they act as protection to facilitate the growth of other plants and to give thanks. The so-called Indian cure from the Rapp book may perhaps represent a legitimate transfer of knowledge from Indigenous communities to the settler-colonizer Rapp family. We cannot forget that in the Rapp book, the efficacy of these recipes was not attested to by the Kaskaskia, Osage, or Erie people whose land they occupied as residents of central Ohio, nor was credit given to the Cherokee, who were being forcibly displaced by the Indian Removal Act of 1830 at the very moment that recipe book was being compiled. Rather, the Rapp family attributed their recipe to a white man named George DeWalt, and you can see that his name is underlined at the very bottom right of that recipe. DeWalt had supposedly tried this cure with very good success, and so was listed by name, while Indigenous people were referenced only as a stereotype. But the inclusion of sunflower in the book gestures, I think, towards the centrality and the importance of Indigenous medicine in both past and in present. And finally, Indigenous culinary and medical expertise has a long legacy in foods like chocolate. Cacao originated in South America and was later introduced to Central America and modern-day Mexico. It has been cultivated by people in those regions for over 2,000 years. For Indigenous people in those parts of the world, cacao was central to their practices of faith, well-being, and community cohesion. It was traded as a valuable commodity and given in tribute across thousands of miles. Mexica people drank their cacao, ground finely and then blended with water, with optional additives like chili, dried flowers, maize, vanilla, and honey. The drink had a frothy top, was consumed in special purpose-made cups, like the one that you can see here, and was considered to be invigorating, a bright sensory experience which was valued for its ability to offer clarity, refreshment, and joy. I admit I do feel those things sometimes too when I eat chocolate today. Now, Europeans first encountered cacao when they invaded the Americas under Columbus. The drink initially caught on in Spain and Portugal and then spread to other European countries, including Britain. By the start of the 18th century, it had an established place in the courts as well as in London's markets and shops. It also appears with regularity in recipe books like this one. This example from Mary Goodson's Book of Receipts here at the RCP shows the adoption of several Mesoamerican ingredients, vanilla and achiote, also called annatto. But it also shows how British people had changed and altered the drink, including ingredients that they were able to access through acts of colonization, theft, and trade around the globe. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, sugar from the Caribbean, ambergris from the open ocean, and musk from Eastern Europe. Experiments with chocolate were a bit more akin to those AI recipes that we encountered at the start of my talk. Most British people living in the metropole would not have spoken to Indigenous experts who had real-life, hands-on knowledge of how chocolate looked or tasted. And some of their resulting experiments probably didn't work out quite the way that they'd planned. In a few moments, we'll gather together to explore Goodson's recipe and taste test her version of chocolate outside. And I want to say just a couple of things about the tasting experience that you're going to encounter. So there are two components to the chocolate tasting. The first is an identification test. So there are 3 samples of chocolate outside, each containing a flavor that was popular in the period, a popular inclusion alongside chocolate. So see if you can kind of guess what each of the 3 flavors are. And staff and myself will be on hand to help you navigate that and to describe the kind of historical significance of each of those 3 flavors because they're iconic. Then you'll have the opportunity to make your own chocolate blend using Goodson's recipe as a pattern. So we have all but one of the ingredients included in Goodson's recipe outside. We have excluded musk or ambergris, which is an animal byproduct that is not widely eaten in Britain today, and in fact, I think is illegal to source. So don't do that. There is a little vial of musk outside if you'd like to smell it, just to get a sense of the kind of sensory experience of it, but please do not consume it or put it in your hot chocolate mix. That's the official word, and it says do not eat on it, so really please don't eat it. It's perfume. I think that adapting and adding the flavors that appeal to you and kind of experimenting with your own blend by pulling out certain things and maybe leaving others to one side really kind of mimics the experience of making chocolate, in fact, in the early modern period, because this is something that early modern people in Britain themselves did as they experimented and adapted this new drink. Now, as we've seen today, despite the efforts of Anglo-American author-compilers, evidence of Black and Indigenous expertise, skill, and experience did, and still do, shine through in 17th and 18th century collections. Whether it was through a quassia cup, a sunflower cure, or a recipe for chocolate, these editions reveal glimpses of the Black and Indigenous women and men who invented and perfected them. Today, close attention to the techniques, preferences, and ingredient profiles included in these books can show us many different kinds of people did help to shape early modern Anglo-American manuscript recipe collections. It's past time for us to give credit where credit is due. Thank you. And just, Gail, give me like a wave when we've run out of time and I need to take the last one. So I'm happy to take some questions if anyone has some. Yes.
The musk that we're smelling outside, is it gone? I was wondering about the musk. Is it produced from the deers or is it synthetic?
So the one that's outside is a synthetic musk. I didn't get one of the originals. I purchased it online, and that was the only one I felt confident in, was a synthetic version. So for those who don't know, musk comes from the gland of musk deer, and it is absolutely worth a little Google to see what a musk deer looks like, because they're quite unusual. They are very small, and they look adorable. They're like golden retriever-sized deer, but then they have tusks, very, very sharp tusks. And so they're like a very unusual-looking animal. They don't look like deer that you'd see out in the park here. So, but yes, it comes from glands in those deer. It's been used for centuries, musk, as a perfume agent, and it was really valued in the early modern period as like a multi-sensory experience. So it's included in perfumes, but it's also included in lots of foods. And I think it's a kind of taste smell that people are getting from it. We don't have as many things that function in quite the same way today in our diets here in modern Britain. But if you've ever had like violet pastille candies, that's one of those where it has a kind of like scent taste at the same time. And so that's what the musk and the ambergris, and ambergris comes from Wales. Another kind of sensory experience that I find it hard personally to enjoy, but I am interested as a scholar. Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
I missed what the Crozier cup. What's it used for? I missed that.
Thank you. Yes. So there are different ideas, and it's always hard to kind of parse what we think it might have been useful for today versus what people in the past thought of it. But in the past, it was a little bit, for some medical practitioners, a little bit of a cure-all. They were kind of fascinated with its properties. Initially, it served as like a kind of antifungal or antibacterial, had antifungal or antibacterial properties, and it was also thought to help with some fevers. The wood itself, the cup was carved into, the wood was carved into a cup, and then water was put in it, and then you just drink the water straight from the cup, and it was thought to kind of imbue the water with those properties. As time goes on, it's still quite popular in European medicine. So its original kind of use was for antifungal, antibacterial properties as well as fevers. And then later on, it's thought to be a good digestive. So it kind of helps you if you're dyspeptic. But yeah, you can still see them in many collections today. And in fact, I noticed as I was Googling it that you can also buy it on the internet for as like a health cure. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for that really interesting talk. I was wondering, over the course of your research, have you come across accounts of people who might be suspicious of certain cures because they might have come from someone that someone said was maybe a witch or witch doctor-y, that kind of like superstition mixed in with the recipe?
So I have not yet come across a recipe in a recipe book that references witchcraft. What I have come across are recipes that are described as coming from people who are often accused of witchcraft. So there's never like a direct tie in the book where they say like, this came from a witch, because I think that would be dangerous for them to write it down that way. But what they do say, like, for example, the salve that comes from an old woman who had grown crooked in her hams is the quote from the book. So they're describing an aged person, possibly a disabled person in the early modern past. And those were absolutely, and a woman, those were absolutely the kind of people who were targeted most frequently under accusations of witchcraft. So it's very possible that some of the people who contributed to books, who are kind of community healers, lower status people, women, they are the target demographic when we think about people accused. Now, there are, in some instances, some very rare survivals of books of magic from the early modern period. My former employer, the Folger Shakespeare Library, has one of these, and it's digitized online, so you can take a look at it, and it is fascinating to page through and look at it. It's fully, in full color, high res. You can zoom in, and my favorite recipe from that grimoire, that book of magic, is to summon a spirit, a familiar, who will help do your business, do your duties. And it has a picture of the familiar, and it has his name. And he's like a little wyvern. He's smiling, and he has a little forked tongue, and his name is Berto. So you can summon Berto using the recipe book. Let me know if you're successful. He seems charming. Oh, just back again. Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, last question. Perfect.
Thank you so much. You mentioned in the chocolate recipe that there were all these recipe ingredients that came from kind of British colonial sources. Do you also see mentions of kind of like Orientalism, of, not just, you talked a lot about African, Black, and Native American, but are there also kind of examples you've seen of Orientalism and India and other maybe Silk Road routes?
Yes, definitely. So, and I'm just in my brain now paging through the recipe books themselves. So what you'll see is the same kind of stereotyping that is leveled against South Asian recipes and South Asian people in recipe books. And that is most frequently through recipes for curry. So you start to see the additive of curry recipes in early modern recipe books right around this time period in the 17th and 18th century. And a lot of the time they'll say that it's a very authentic curry. And it's not, it's not. It's not authentic to what was being made in the time period in South Asia at that moment, or Southeast Asia. But it is kind of fascinating to see. And this has been an object of fascination for historians too. And so there are a couple of really great articles about those early curry recipes, which you can even, again, just Google and they will crop up. They're in popular publications as well as scholarly publications, kind of parsing the differences with some of those early curry recipes. Yeah. Okay, thank you all so much for your questions. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda. That was a really fascinating talk. I just wanted to mention, you might not have come across it, we do actually have a defense against witchcraft in one of our recipes books. So there is a recipe in there, a good receipt against witchcraft. So we have a little blog on it. So if you want to have a look that up, do have a look at our website, just thought I'd say. Okay, so our next trip, I'll show you where we're going. We're going down and outside into our medicinal garden, and there will be refreshments and also the chance to take part in the two activities that Amanda's mentioned. So tasting the chocolate and then getting to mix up your own little hot chocolate mix to take away home with you. Now, for the chocolate tasting, I just want to mention, we've just got sample labels so that you can have a bit of mystery, but if you do have any allergies or dietary requirements, it is inside. So I don't want anyone to worry if you've got any allergies. There is the information right there, so you'll be able to check just in case. If you're guessing, though, don't peek. Okay, thank you all, everyone, and thank you again, Amanda, and let's head out.